Here's what's coming up on episode 69 of the Big Séance podcast. Tim Stevens.
And so I wrote a feature film script, and then I pared that down until I got it to a 6-minute short film, which was pretty difficult because it's a big story. It's basically a Western, so it's very expansive. So getting it down into something that you could watch in 5 minutes is pretty difficult. If you're screenwriting right, a page equals a minute. So that was a 22-minute film. And it involved like live horses and a bonfire and, like gunshots. And it was intense. And I did a budget on it. It was going to be probably around $50,000.
Oh my gosh.
She actually took me and we went to the Voodoo spiritual temple, and she really helped me clarify, where Hollywood had gotten things wrong and what I could do, in my film to represent Voodoo in at least a sympathetic light. We're all afraid of the unknown, mm-hmm. and I try to portray the unknown in various, in any way I can in the works that I do. I know this is your show, but I'm going to call you out. Can you do your best Dracula impersonation?
Oh my God! Okay,
I'll do it too after you do it, okay. So we can. I'll do the Coppola version. So.
Oh gosh!
The children of the night, what sweet music they make.
Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Séance.
So I've got a big episode for you this week. So if you're driving to work, take a few wrong turns on accident, maybe. I know that sometimes I want to do that when I'm driving to school and listening to podcasts. Sometimes you just don't want to get out of the car. Before we talk to Tim Stevens, this week I want to go ahead and cover some announcements and shoutouts first. As of a few days ago, the Big Séance podcast has been added to the iHeart Radio directory of podcasts. This is big news for us, because if you didn't know, iHeart Media has the largest reach of any radio or television outlet in America. And now they have the Big Séance podcast. It's exciting stuff. You can find a link to the podcast in iHeart's directory in the show notes. It's cool stuff. I'm very excited to see where this goes. I'm also excited to announce that I have been asked to be a speaker at the American Hauntings 2016 Fall Festival by Troy Taylor, who was on the show a few months ago. Troy also organizes the Haunted America Conference, which, as you probably know, I recently returned from. But this fall festival is meant to kick off the Halloween season, and this year it'll be in Jacksonville, Illinois on September 24th. If you plan on attending, please let me know. It is free. I'll have a link to this information in the show notes as well. As I mentioned in the last episode, I will be attending Kansas City Paracon on August 6th and 7th, which is just a few weeks away. I already know that I'll be seeing Denise Sia there. I was interviewed on 2 fabulous shows recently. I was a guest on Paranormal Underground Radio in the Dark with Karen Frazier and Chucky G on June 30th. And Marla Martenson's YouTube show, Cosmic Conversations, on July 8th. If you find you haven't had enough of my nerdiness here, hop on over to those shows if you're brave enough. I was honored to be asked to be on both of these great shows, so thank you. And I should also mention that Marla Martenson will be a guest here on the Big Séance podcast very soon. so stay tuned. She has such an interesting life, and I think many of you could probably relate to the journey that she's on. A while back, I heard from Amber at bigseance.com, and she says, I just found your podcast and have been listening, and I must say I love it. I am a spiritualist by religion, and everything you've been presenting on your podcast resonates as truth with me. It's great to find communities of like-minded enthusiasts. Well, thank you, Amber. Welcome to our Paranerd community, and you rock. If you haven't joined us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook, you really should, Amber. And I received an email from Mac Connor, who says, Hi, Patrick. I am a big fan of your show. I wanted to write you with some feedback and share my appreciation of what you do. Listening to your show for nearly a year has had me laugh, shiver, and question. You have a magnetic way of storytelling. Your commentary and interviews are fun and insightful. There have been so many fascinating guests. I set up an appointment with Dina DeCastro this coming August after hearing her twice on the show. I am looking forward to it. About this time a year ago, I finished reading The Fun of Dying by Roberta Grimes. It was a great and informative book. I hope to hear her on your show. I found it exciting that so much evidence is being affirmed and shared. I appreciate those who share their experience and knowledge in a way that fosters growth. As the old adage goes, dead men tell no tales. Or do they? Let your listeners know if we should reach out to any potential guest you're interested in. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Patrick, my good sir, you rock. Thank you so much. Sincerely yours, Mac Connor. Well, thank you, Mac, for that very well-written email. I've responded to Mac, and I've let him know that he may have just inspired me to start a guest wish list of some sort. We'll see. You rock too, Mac. If you have any questions or comments for me or for the general audience of the Big Seance podcast, depending on what's going on, I do sometimes read these things on the show. You can also send in audio feedback, and many of you know how to do that. You can find out how to do that by going to bigseance.com or listen to the outro at the end of the show. But I do love hearing from you and learning about my listeners. All right, you've been very patient. Here's my interview with Tim Stevens. Pour the tea. So a few months ago, I was working on a list of goals for the show, and I've been keeping them in an app called Evernote on my phone. And one of those goals was cover or interview the creator of an independent horror or ghost film. Well, call it synchronicity. Maybe you could call it manifesting. Maybe it's something I manifested. But this episode basically just fell in my lap, and I love it when it happens this way. Today, I'm excited to talk to Tim Stevens. He first discovered his love for cinema at a young age, watching classic Gothic horror films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. It was a discovery that film could be art and take audiences to places they never imagined. Tim continued his love of film by attending film school at the University of North Texas. Having graduated, Tim currently writes, directs, and produces short films that express his love of horror, fantasy, and avant-garde. And today, we're specifically going to talk about his latest short film titled The Resurrectionist. Welcome to the parlor, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sitting here talking to Tim, and I don't often see my guests on video when we do interviews, but Tim has proven to me that he is hardcore in his, I don't know what you call it, his paranerdiness, I guess I'll say for now. But he has, I'll let him describe it, but he's got a kerosene lamp going, and he says that his room is decorated basically to take him back to the days of spiritualism or the Victorian age. Really quick, this is quite an interesting way to start out our interview, but tell us how you've got your place decorated there.
Sure. So I am in, I don't know, it's the spare bedroom, but I call it the study because, that sounds better. But, so I've been binge listening to the Big Séance for a little bit now. And I've really become obsessed with it. There's a couple of podcasts I listen to. Welcome to Night Vale, which I'm a huge fan of, and then this one. So anyway, it's a huge honor for me to be a part of this, and I felt like I needed to set the mood for this. So I've got a kerosene lantern burning here. I've got a 100-year-old 1914 William Fold Ouija board, which is sitting on my desk. The desk itself is from the 1880s that I found, kind of lucky find on Craigslist. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I wanted to kind of set the tone for this seance parlor experience. So anyway, I'm quirky like that. I'm just happy to be a part of this, and I wanted to create a mood.
You have impressed me, and you're in the right place. So it's an honor to have you listening to the podcast. It's very cool. So I kind of want you to introduce us to the Resurrectionist first. I've seen it. I love it. Tell the listeners about the Resurrectionist.
Sure. So, the Resurrectionist actually came to me as an idea 2 years ago, roughly. And so I wrote a feature film script, which is as yet kind of unproduced. And then I pared that down until I got it to a 6-minute short film, which was pretty difficult because it's a big story. It's basically a Western, so it's very expansive, so getting it down into something that you could watch in 5 minutes was pretty difficult. But, so in November of last year, we shot the film after doing a Indiegogo campaign and raising the money. And so it basically tells the story of a young man who kind of skipped out of the Civil War. He's a Southern guy. And then he comes back with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau during the Reconstruction era to start a black schoolhouse. And he ends up falling in love with one of the older students that is there, who you find out is a kind of in secret practicing voodoo. And so this takes place in East Texas, so almost Louisiana. So it has this real New Orleans kind of Cajun vibe to it. And at that time, the Ku Klux Klan was basically the law in that area. And they were, kind of subversively fighting the northern occupiers that were there at that time. And so there's this obvious clash of interest between my main character, whose name is Henri St. Pierre, and his love with this young black voodoo priestess named Rosalie, and then of course the Klan, who would definitely not want that happening in their town. So I don't want to go into too much. I'd rather people just watch the film because it is very short. But the conflict is rising between the eventual killing of his lover Rosalie, and then the desperation that comes along with that from the main character, and this desire to do anything and everything to bring her back to life, pretty much at all cost.
I can only imagine the challenge that would be to express everything you just did in 6 minutes. To me, that as a person who is, involved in the arts and a creator of whether it be music or content, I very often end up saying, "Oh my gosh, this is too long. What, I need to cut it down." I can't imagine how tough that would be.
Yeah. Well, the first version of the script, was about 20 to 22 pages long, which is if you're screenwriting right, a page equals a minute. So that was a 22-minute film. And it involved like live horses and a bonfire and, like gunshots. And it was intense. And I did a budget on it. It was going to be probably around 50 grand.
Oh my gosh.
Which I was like, no, I can't, I can't film this, not on a crowdfunding level, so I really I had to work hard to pare it down into something that tells a whole story. And it was a real challenge. I worked with my cinematographer, Kyle Montgomery, to make sure that every scene and every shot tells, kind of like a picture's worth 1,000 words. So everything in the shot advances the story, because if we didn't do that, it was either going to be too long or too ambiguous, for you to understand what's going on. So that was one of our challenges. So I hope we accomplished that. People often tell me that they want to know what the rest of the story is, which I guess is good, because it is a little chunk of a big story that hopefully, with the help of going to film festivals and meeting people, we can get this made into a feature film, which is really, I think where the film belongs.
Absolutely. Well, you already know that I love the feel and the look of your films. And I can see right now that even in your daily life that you like to kind of create the atmosphere. And I can definitely appreciate that. But yeah, your stuff is shot beautifully. What inspires you to make a film like The Resurrectionist?
Well, I went to New Orleans when I was 14 or so. And it was actually, I was going as a part of a mission trip. And so this was pre-Katrina. And so we were doing, service work in, like the projects areas, the Fourth Ward, which, was eventually totally washed out. And, I was at the time I was reading Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, and then seeing, this area that she describes so beautifully in her books in real life. And I kind of, I was listening to your episode about you going on that trip with your mom down to New Orleans, right? And you described this real kind of disconcerting feeling that you got even 20, even like 20 miles outside the city, right?
On the interstate. Yeah.
Yeah. And I experienced that so heavily, especially along Bourbon Street, where it was this just really heavy, inexplicable feeling where I felt like there was a literal kind of spirit of New Orleans, I really have a hard time explaining that. But since then, I've been really enchanted with the kind of the haunting Southern charm that Louisiana has for itself. And that ultimately, I think, led me to explore what kind of themes I could bring up, and then eventually writing the script for The Resurrectionist.
Well, and there's a lot of, just in 6 minutes, it's amazing. There's a lot of sensitive material in there, and material that requires a lot of knowledge of history. So what research goes into, there's the voodoo side of things, and
right.
How did you go about doing that? What research went into this?
Yeah. So in addition to being a paranerd, I'm kind of which I love that word. I've been using that with my friends now. I've got a friend who actually published a book about growing up in a haunted house. And I was a week ago or so, I was telling her about your podcast, and I go, listen, there's a word for us.
Yes. Spread it around.
Yeah. And she was like, oh my God, I'm going to be using that all the time. So, but,
and you know what? I don't know that I can even claim that. I don't remember if I heard that somewhere or not. I may have even heard someone say that before, but I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, in addition to that, I'm definitely a history nerd. So I'm inspired a lot by historical events, and I feel like I really have to know a subject matter before I can write about it, because I think Hollywood gets it wrong a lot of the times, where they'll latch on to a little piece of information and then just create something that's totally off base of reality. And I realize I'm making a horror film, so we're talking about a certain level of unreality, but I feel like it needs to be anchored in historical fact. So, the idea for the Resurrectionist really came to me a couple of years ago. My wife and I were going on a trip to New Orleans. And the idea of the Resurrectionist had already started to kind of brew at that point, but I didn't really have any specific details in mind. Just kind of a very general setting and an idea. And so we set out. We both live in Dallas, so we set out east towards Shreveport, and then our trip took us kind of southeast down through Baton Rouge, and then eventually Natchitoches, and then further along to New Orleans. And along the way, we stopped at several plantations around the Natchitoches area, which I don't know if you've seen the film 12 Years a Slave at all.
Yes.
Yeah, which one of my favorite films. I mean, it's extremely graphic and it's depressing, and but it's so beautiful, and I think the visual dichotomy of this just extremely almost like dreamlike southern environment with the big cypress trees and the Spanish moss, and it's so at odds with the awful condition of the people that were enslaved in that area. And so I'd seen that film, and that actually took place right near the Natchitoches area along the Cane River, I think is what they call it. Is where the sugar cane plantations were, which from my research, was showing me that those were the worst plantations to work, the most brutal sort of work, much more than cotton or whatever else you might be working on. So we stopped at a few, namely the Magnolia Plantation, which was actually featured on an episode of Ghost Adventures. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you remember that episode.
I don't remember it specifically, but I've seen them all, I promise you. So
yeah. So, which I'd seen that one as well. And, some of the plantations we went to gave me this real sense of peace, and, like the past no longer affected it. And it was just, that kind of quintessential Southern charm that you get when you see many of these old plantation homes. But Magnolia Plantation, we actually got there just near sunset, and the actual tours had already stopped. They had shut it down. And so don't tell anybody this, but we actually hopped a fence to. Oh yeah, sorry. to go take a look at it, and there's about 6 or 7, maybe 8 brick and stone slave cabins that are out there, and that's actually, you may remember, Zach Bagans did a
I'm remembering this now. As soon as you said the slave cabins, I'm remembering.
Yeah, and he was in there, and they were talking about the graffiti that was on the walls, and how they did this EVP session, and he's yelling and saying this ridiculous thing, "Do some voodoo magic on me," which was really funny to me.
It's very Zach.
Yeah, for sure. And so in the EVP, you hear something that sounds like chanting in the background, almost like a group of men in the distance chanting something. Anyway, so to kind of segue here, I got a really heavy feeling from going on to the plantation that evening, which drove a lot of my, I think, trying to empathize with Rosalie character in my film, who what was an ex-slave, recently freed, and that I think that helped me develop her character quite a lot. But as a horror filmmaker, I try to draw from my own experience, and I actually had kind of a little paranormal experience while I was on the plantation there at Magnolia. And I have a recording of it, but I don't have it pulled up right now. But it was sunset, and as I was walking towards the slave cabins, I started to hear in the distance something that sounded basically like a chain gang. So this like call and repeat action going on. So one voice really loudly, it was muffled, so it sounded like, and then in the background, several men repeating the same phrase. And I heard it up until I got right to the cabins, and then it went away. And this is a very rural area. There was nobody around. The tours were over. So that was a really eerie experience. So I felt like that maybe that was a relevant story for this podcast. Yeah, it was just a really chilling experience for me. From there, my wife and I, we went to Baton Rouge, and then we went down to New Orleans. And I had prearranged a meeting with a woman named Lilith Dorsey, who I had actually connected with online. She's a filmmaker that lives in Brooklyn, but she had studied under the famous priestess Miriam Charmani, who is one of the big three voodoo personalities in New Orleans. There's like Bloody Mary, the Reverend Zombie, I think. I might be getting that wrong. And then there's Miriam Charmani. And so she had studied under her, and I had told her about my initial ideas, and I really felt like I needed some clarification on aspects of voodoo that I felt were probably some misinformation, that I was getting, and I really wanted to get the facts straight before I started writing the film. And so it was really cool. I met up with Lilith. We had a couple of beers at Jean Lafitte's bar. It's this cool old bar that's like, it's from the 1670s or something like this.
Yeah.
It's the oldest running bar in America by Jean Lafitte, who was he was a pirate. But anyway, we had a great talk, and then she actually took me, and we went to the Voodoo Spiritual Temple, and I talked for about an hour with Miriam Charmani, and she really helped me clarify where Hollywood had gotten things wrong, and what I could do, in my film to represent voodoo in at least a sympathetic light, because I feel like Hollywood has really characterized voodoo as like headhunters and cannibals and voodoo dolls and this real evil thing that I had the sneaking suspicion was incorrect. And
probably our culture has in general a very embarrassing kind of elementary understanding of what voodoo is.
Yeah. And, it's based totally on, I don't know, like films like White Zombie from it's like the 20s, I think, or the 30s, which, is very, it's interesting. It's kind of quirky, but, I think that started this sort of obsession with characterizing voodoo as being a primitive and uncivilized religion, It probably goes back further than that, honestly, but I think Hollywood has been guilty of not really like even trying to get their facts straight. And I definitely knew it had to be a big piece of the film, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't, contribute to that misinformation. So
I think probably those of us who we have not studied the art of film, can you tell us because I'm not sure, like when some people hear a horror film, I think maybe some people get confused with slasher films or like, I don't know, some people might be thinking Freddy Krueger in their brain, and to me, your work is not any of those things. It's very classic, I guess, is the word that kind of would pop in my brain. How would you describe your brand of horror as a genre, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would consider it supernatural or paranormal horror. So most of what I'm dealing with is, often death becomes in death, not in the sense of like, I don't know, Hostel or Saw. Death is a kind of philosophic subject, comes up a lot. And what that means, between, the relationship between the living and the dead, and what it means as a living person to grapple with the idea of mortality, and I, I'm really inspired by like Gothic literature. So Dracula, Frankenstein, works by Oscar Wilde, which Edgar Allan Poe, which I think at that time, it was really taking a hard look at those subjects and portraying the horror of it, but also the symbolic nature that is kind of in those things. So that's really what I try to do. So I think the horror comes from that, we're all afraid of the unknown. And I try to portray the unknown in various, in any way I can in the works that I do. And, sometimes it's the characters, unwillingness to accept the unknown, and that becomes their undoing, or it becomes the acceptance of the unknown, which, they initially have some sort of conflict with and then have to come to terms with. And so yeah, that's kind of where I come from with that. It is, like you say, kind of a classic view on horror. I don't really get into gory films. They don't do anything for me. But a good supernatural thriller will, rivet me to the very end, and then the credits roll, and then I find myself thinking about, these aspects of life and death that I don't really do, we don't deal with on a daily basis. So, if I can contribute to that, that's kind of, I guess, what I would say my mission statement is.
I, as many people who listen to this podcast know, I think it's very unusual for a paranerd like myself to not have had a lot of paranormal experiences growing up. But that's one of the first questions I get asked, either whether I'm on an interview or on another show.
Yeah.
And I had to break it to him that this has been kind of a recent thing. Just in the last 10 years, I didn't have a lot of paranormal experiences. Did you have any paranormal experiences growing up that helped, bring you to where you are today in your art?
I did, actually. Funnily enough, growing up, I was not, and so when I say growing up, like, up until the age of like maybe 15 or so, I was not into horror films. In fact, they disturb me and they cause lack of sleep, and I shun them, as much as I could. But in retrospect, when I really started to develop my voice and, kind of the subjects that I was interested in, my experiences growing up, I think really helped develop those things. It's hard for me to say whether or not these experiences I had, which were probably around elementary school and early middle school, were legitimate, whether or not I've convinced myself that these things were real. But, I can remember even in middle school and in high school, remembering these experiences very vividly. And so I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to explain, but, there was one point, my mom is a professional photographer, and she had a business in Canyon, Texas, which is this little town, pretty old. And there was it was the Britton Studio, which had been around since the 1800s as a working photography studio. And ironically enough, at one point, a small movie house, which is kind of cool. And I would hang out there in the summer, when I wasn't in school. And across the street, there was this old church, which I would say was probably from either the early 1900s or earlier, and been boarded up for years. Eventually got bulldozed, which is unfortunate. But all the local kids, and I had some friends that were in the neighborhood. We were all convinced this place was haunted because it looked like it should be haunted. And so we would go check it out. And I remember one time, it was the middle of the day. Me and two other my friends, we walked up to the building, and there's a side door along the left. This was a very small, kind of one room type chapel. There's a small door off to the left, which I at the time was assuming was a entrance into like an office or something. And it was definitely locked. We had tried it before to see if we could get in, and we jokingly knocked really hard as if we were expecting an answer. We waited about, 10 seconds, not long. And then all of a sudden the door shook violently back and forth. So much that if it kept on going, it probably would have, ripped the rotted wood open, and then, the door itself would have opened. And, being kids, like, we're not going to stick around to see what the end of that is. We ran screaming back across the street to the photography studio. And, in retrospect, I thought, okay, there was someone inside that was joking with us. But the front doors there was only two entrances. There was that one entrance which the door shook, and then the front one, which are these double doors, which were locked and also had a chain and a padlock across them, so that there was no way anyone was getting in or out. Plus, all the windows were boarded up. So I don't know what that was about, but I remember it very, very vividly, and it's hard for me to imagine that I made that up. You know,
you may never know.
Who knows? I don't know, but I mean, that's pretty intense. That's like that's physical manifestations. Like I didn't see something like an apparition. Like I saw a door shake that should not have shaken.
Well, when two people, you said there was one other person with you, right?
Two other people.
Do they have the same recollection now that you had? I mean, that's pretty powerful if three people experience the same thing.
Yeah, one of them does. One of them was really freaked out, and then several weeks later denied having experienced that. So I don't know.
Wow.
What's going on there. Except that when I would bring up the subject, he would get kind of angry. Like
fear.
like damn it, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. So I don't know. But it's experiences like that I think made me more open to the idea of the paranormal, which, I think definitely affected the kind of art that I wanted to create. So, yeah. And there's other experiences that I've had that none more like visceral than that. That was a pretty intense experience. I definitely haven't experienced anything like that since then either. So
you shot this film in Jefferson, Texas. What's special about Jefferson?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably several small towns that claim this, but according to the city of Jefferson, it is the most haunted city in Texas. And actually, I have some a friend who's a psychic who's had some very intense experiences in some 150-year-old hotels that are there in Jefferson. But the main reason I chose that place is I'd been there probably 4 years ago. It's right on the Louisiana line, so it's more Louisiana than it is Texas. So it's got the cypress trees, Spanish moss everywhere. There's Lake Caddo, which is this huge prehistoric lake with 500-year-old trees there that haven't been disturbed in ages. Alligators, and
I'd be out on that one. Sorry, peace out. So let's get technical now. I think okay. I like seeing behind the scenes of how movies are made, and I might not have the opportunity to interview somebody like this again. What goes into producing an independent film nowadays, and what are some, I guess I'd say, what are some of the biggest challenges of doing that?
Sure. I think, the most obvious thing is money. I work in film, but it's, I'm making I'm editing a lot. I'm creating kind of low budget television, documentary type stuff. Not a lot of money in that, unfortunately. So, it's got to either come from my pocket or from somebody else's pocket. So, creating a film, especially a period film, is very difficult because I'm always taken out of a film when I watch it and I know that the items in there are not right. Like I see a zipper in a Western, I'm like, oh my God. So, it's important to me, especially with the Resurrectionist, that I get everything right. And getting things right costs money because I can't just go out to a thrift store and buy these things. Then we decided to shoot in Jefferson, which is about 3.5 hours outside of Dallas towards Louisiana. It was a 2-day shoot, so we had to shoot, so we had to stay overnight. I don't want my crew to have to pay for food and lodging and that sort of thing, so we have to pay for that. So, there's all these logistical things that present a challenge just to, hopping outside my house and,
right.
my DSLR camera and going out and making a movie, right? Most of the film is at night, so we have to light it all. I can't depend on, if I get lights cost money. I can't depend on the sun for a lot of it. So, eventually, and I don't like to do this a lot because I don't like to beg. We decided to do an Indiegogo campaign.
Mm-hmm.
We raised probably, 80% of our budget that way. And I kind of reached out to I don't know if you're familiar with the steampunk sub-community. So people that are really into like kind of Victorian retro futurism, and they dress, corsets and top hats, and it's a fun thing. And I have a lot of friends and inroads with that sort of thing that I've developed over the years. So I really reached out to them and said, here's a film that is a fantasy in many ways. It's not your typical steampunk film. No one's wearing goggles. No one's driving steam powered dirigibles through the air and that sort of thing. But it is historical.
The goggles cracks me up.
Yeah. There is brass in the film, but the brass is historical brass. It's not added for flair. Anyway. So, I said, here's a film that, and all steampunks appreciate history, and they're all really history nerds at the core of it. And I said, here's a film that looks at the past and kind of reinterprets it, but, appeals to their kind of intellectual, tendencies and that sort of thing. And they really came out in force and helped me fund, most of what I needed to produce the film. So yeah, I mean, you're asking me about challenges. That's the biggest challenge. The second biggest challenge I think is just making something look like a film on a low budget. And by looking like a film, I mean not like a home movie with, someone's iPhone, right? So there's certain things that you have to do, the way you light it, the lenses that you use.
I have to tell you, that's the first thing that pops in my brain when I watch The Resurrectionist is the quality of, like, you don't, unless I looked at the time, if you look at see how long the video is, it's 6 minutes. But if you don't know, you would think you were sitting in a theater watching any big budget film. It's really the look of it is, I don't know, quality, classy. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't look like a low budget, what you would expect a low budget film to look like.
Well, I appreciate that. So you may have some filmmaker listeners. I don't know. Just a little peek behind what we did. There's these scenes that take place at the crossroads, which, in kind of Southern myth is a magical place. It's the idea of like ley lines that, are in the earth. And it's where you go to make a deal with this spiritual entity that Henri St. Pierre eventually, makes a deal with this entity as Papa Legba to bring his lover back to life. So we shot out in the swamp, the literal swamp, with alligators and cypress trees and the whole 9 yards. But we didn't have enough money to really light that like a typical Hollywood movie, which they would bring in these 18K lights. So, your average light bulb is like 60 watts, something like this is 18,000 watts. I'm sorry. No. 1,800 watts. But
okay.
Anyway, very bright lights,
football field lights.
Yeah. It's meant to replicate the sun, and that sort of thing. And, cool. I would have loved if we had the kind of money, but we didn't. So we ended up shooting that during the day. And then in editing, we created the illusion that it was shot at night. So we saved money that way, which was kind of cool. And then in the cabin scene, which was a authentic Cajun, swamp cabin, we shot with, I think, no more than, my cinematographer might have to correct me on this, but I think like 3 lights. And then we had actual lanterns, which added some natural light. So really, all in all, like we didn't have to use much light. We just used it very selectively, and we tried to emulate candlelight and emulate moonlight in such a way that, it blends into the scene and, without using a whole bunch of stuff, because we didn't really have that at our disposal. So, and that's not me. That's my cinematographer, my gaffer. They did brilliantly. I can't claim any of that, but it's amazing what you can do if you kind of think outside the box about what's possible.
How many people were working on this film?
Oh man, 12 possibly, and that includes the cast as well. So we had 4 actors and maybe 10 crew. So that's 14. I also really, was very blessed in the fact that my costumer, mostly what she does is she costumes for Civil War reenactments. So she has this huge, collection of period clothing that, she just has lying around.
Bonus.
I know, right? Yeah, and she was a friend, and she's into the steampunk community, so she was so enthusiastic about coming out and helping. And if we were budgeting on a feature film, we would have had to make all that stuff from scratch, which is just crazy expensive. And, luckily enough, Cheryl Trent is her name. She just had all this stuff. And so she just had to kind of take out some seams and resize them for the actors that would be in them. So, yeah, I would say if we have any filmmakers that are listening, create, if you're looking to create some high quality stuff, but you don't have a lot of, money, look to the resources you have. So, you have friends that do unusual things, maybe, recruit that person to be a part of your film. You're close to a really unusual, unique place, film there because, everybody's seeing the inside of, an apartment, or, or the typical, I don't know, parking garage with the city in the background. We've all seen that in low budget films. But maybe you live near a really unique place that no one's seen before. If automatically by filming in that location, you add amount of interest and uniqueness to your film that you couldn't get, just by thinking, well, all I have is, my apartment. I guess I better make a film in an apartment. I don't know, so there's ways you can do it without spending, a bunch of money and taking out, a big credit card and going into debt, which is also an option. I wouldn't recommend it. So,
so I'm a music nerd too. Tell us a little bit about how the music comes together in this film.
Yeah. So the music was composed by a good friend of mine, who's into bluegrass and that sort of thing. If you've ever heard of Denton, Texas, it's this little hub of music and arts. A lot of people call it like a mini Austin, but it's really much cooler than Austin, in my opinion. So he comes out of that art scene. Lundi Knight is his name, and his wife Morgan Knight. And I talked to them early before we were shooting about this idea, and he was like, man, whatever I can do to be a part of this, you just let me know. And so after the film was shot, I ended up approaching him about making the film. And we were kind of miraculously, we talk about synchronicity. Him and I were on the exact same page. We sat down in a coffee shop, and he tells me his thoughts, and I'm like, oh, you're just speaking what's in my head, and I don't have to say anything, which was really fantastic. And so we tried to record the soundtrack using instruments that were as period as possible. So there's kind of I wouldn't even call it a violin. It's a fiddle. It's very kind of detuned and raw in parts of it. All the bass stuff is a literal stand-up bass, bowed. So it kind of creates this really eerie, ambient, ghostly feel. There's a steel guitar. Well, not a steel guitar, a steel resonator guitar, which you hear in classic, spirituals, blues that, were around that time. I think there may even be some banjo in there. So, our approach for that was, simplicity, It doesn't get in the way of the film. It doesn't call too much attention to itself, but it's also the right period. So you don't hear any big, like, I don't know, classic Hollywood type of soundtrack in there with big orchestration and, cymbals and that sort of thing. So it was kind of our approach with that. We even recorded our own version of Ain't No Grave, which is a old black spiritual. So we did kind of I think haunting, but also upbeat version of it that happens in the credits.
Mm-hmm.
And that also has its own kind of analogy to the film. Ain't no grave can hold my body down. So there's that kind of biblical resurrection theme going on there. So yeah, that was kind of our approach. I was very blessed to, again, have friends that were able to do, what the film required, and I thought about the film in my own circle instead of trying to reach beyond that, which meant we were able to create something that was, I think, really high quality and very real without breaking the bank. So
I agree. Though it's one of my complaints about the show Conan and Doyle, right? Is it the show that's out?
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen it yet. It sounds cool though.
Well, it's stylistically, the costumes and the setting and stuff, you're right there in that time period. And all of a sudden, like the soundtrack in the background takes you to like a modern day club, and I'm like,
weird.
What? That, like you said, that takes me right out of it. And maybe not everybody, but for me, I don't know if it's being a musician or what it is, but I'm just like, oh my God, you ruined it for me.
Yeah, there's another film or another series, a Netflix series called Peaky Blinders. I don't know if you've seen that. I want to say it's in like the 19 teens in Britain. It's dealing with organized crime and this sort of thing, but they'll have like 80s rock music going in the background, which I dig, but not when we're talking about a period piece like that. I don't know. I feel like a film should be an immersive experience, and you should be totally locked into what's going on. And if you don't create the right environment, then people are just going to be pulled out of it. Like a good example is The Conjuring 2, which just came out. And that a good portion of the soundtrack are popular music from the 70s, which I just totally love. Like, it just puts me right in the time period, and I understand what's going on. It maybe makes the supernatural stuff that much more believable, because I'm not questioning this world that is being created, So I don't know, it's a stylistic choice. Some people will do it. I want to build something that doesn't pull me out of the time period. I've heard you say this, that you really like, being absorbed in the environment and the time period of whatever space is being created or presented. So kind of hopefully that's what we did with the Resurrectionist.
Yeah.
So,
where do you find a studio to record?
Denton, like I said, is this kind of this cool, hip, artsy gym just north of Dallas. That's College Town. That's where the University of North Texas is, which I went to school at. And there's this cool little production studio that is in this guy's house. And so we literally recorded in a Victorian home with woodline walls. I don't know, I'm not like an audiophile, so I can't speak to this, but my feeling is that, recording in this space that has natural wooden acoustics really helped create this kind of warm, natural feel to it. It was definitely, this guy lives there, that sort of thing. So it was a cool experience, I think it was just perfect for the type of music that we were recording, and then also just the independent nature of the project.
Well, yeah, I think, musicians at that time period weren't hanging out with acoustic tile on their walls. So it's probably good.
Sure. And I'm remembering it's called Captive Ear Studios.
Oh, okay.
So I think there may be a Facebook page or a website that people can figure that out. But he does a lot of folk music, which is really kind of what led my choice in recording at this space, because we wanted somebody that understands how a violin should be recorded and how an acoustic voice should sound. You know, I love the film "O Brother, Where Art Thou?"
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and they've got all this cool bluegrass stuff, and you know it's recorded in a way that I think is accurate for the time in that film. So I wanted to kind of do the same thing with what we did for this film. So,
can you give us 3 films that you think should be required watching for lovers of this horror genre?
Oh man, yeah, I think so. So are we talking like that kind of supernatural, paranormal horror?
I guess if we're thinking about your feel of horror films and kind of what led you to the genre you're in now, the feel, what 3 films would you recommend?
Man. This is difficult, but
bam, I gotcha.
Yeah. Oh, the call's over. I'm done. No.
Out of time.
So I would say, and so this, I wouldn't call this horror, but it's been a huge inspiration for just me as a filmmaker, is La Belle, la Bete by Jean Cocteau. And it's La Belle, la Bete means the Beauty and the Beast. So it was created in the 30s, I think. It was a French surrealist filmmaker, Jean Cocteau. And he did this breathtaking surrealist interpretation, but it's actually it's more classic, and I think true to the actual like original story than a lot of modern interpretations have been of the story of the Beauty and the Beast. But it's all black and white, and I actually had the privilege of seeing a restored 35 millimeter copy of it at a indie theater here in Dallas recently. And I saw it with my wife, and she can attest to this. I was actually crying during the film. Oh my gosh. Not because of the emotional factor, because parts of it are kind of cheesy, because it's got that, I don't know, like old movies do sometimes. But it was just so beautiful, and it has a spiritual quality to it that kind of transcends, you as the viewer. And definitely it has these effects that were just pioneering for the time, very surreal, ghostly effects that are going on. So I would say that is one of them, just for the supernatural effect. My second one would be Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Have you seen that film before?
I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, so good.
I think when I was in high school, I kind of went through a little obsession with that film. We did Dracula as a play when I was in high school, and I was the shortest Dracula in history.
You played Dracula?
I played Dracula. So I watched that movie like 10 times.
I know this is your show, but I'm going to call you out. Can you do your best Dracula impersonation?
Oh my God. Do you know how much of high school I don't even remember? Like, I don't.
So there's the classic line, the children of the night, what sweet music they make.
The children of the night, what sweet music they make.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do it too after you do it.
Okay.
So we can I'll do the Coppola version. So.
Oh gosh. The children of the night, what sweet music they make.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Kind of this.
Did I get the line right?
Yeah,
Okay.
That was like kind of the sultry, wooing version of Dracula.
Oh, great. Okay, your turn.
Okay, here we go. So this would be, was it Gary Oldman, right, that was in the film?
Yep.
All right, so this is him. He's looking out over the castle out the window, and he's just licked some blood off of Jonathan Harker's razor blade, right? And there's these wolves that are howling in the background. Mm-hmm. And he goes, the children of the night, what sweet music they make.
You got me, man. You so beat me. And obviously it's been a long time since I've seen Dracula. And our production was so not taken to Broadway or off Broadway or anywhere near Broadway.
There's probably lots of, hands, risen before you with claw-like fingers,
Probably. The coolest part about that I remembered is, and I actually convinced my director that this was okay to do, but I had to sneak back to the back of the theater for an entrance, and I was going to come up through the audience. And there was one night where the timing was off and I couldn't get into the theater entrance, which was on the side of the audience. So I couldn't sneak in and get to the back of the theater. So when it came time to my entrance, I just busted through the side door and had kids screaming and probably some crying and just, it was so scary. And so I was like, can I do that for the rest of the nights? That was awesome.
That's wonderful. I love it.
I do remember that. And I remember holding my candelabra through half the show. I thought that was cool. I felt real classy doing that.
So yeah, that film has been a huge influence on me. It's Coppola is a admittedly huge fan of Gothic horror. And I think I've heard some interviews where he says that he really feels like his best work, despite everybody remembering him for his crime dramas and his mob films, is really, films like Coppola's Dracula. So I think it's very masterful. There's some brilliant kind of phantasmagoric effects that go on. And there's Ouija boards and there's seances, there's absinthe. The best experience I've had watching that film was drinking absinthe, by the way. So
what is that? What is absinthe? I've always wondered that.
It's this really high volume alcoholic liqueur that's one part sweet fennel, anise, and wormwood. So it kind of tastes like licorice, which is star anise. That's the anise is where the licorice comes from, but it's very light flavored compared to something like what am I thinking of that Jaeger? It doesn't taste anything like Jaeger. So it's kind of a transcendent sort of intoxication that you can have, but. There's this one part where I think, if I'm remembering right, Dracula pours Mina a glass of absinthe, and I don't know, I just nerd out all over that film.
So if I'm counting correctly, you have one more film.
Yeah, the third film I'd have to say Insidious.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which it's a more modern film. I think it came out 5 years ago or so. And, I love that film because I feel it's really, truly scary. And it deals with supernatural and paranormal matters in a way that isn't exploitative and I think gets to the heart of what those things can be, the darker side of, paranormal experiences. It's just, man. And at the same time, it's very poetic and it's very poignant. And there's, parts that, really tug at your heartstrings and parts that are just like unbelievably terrifying as well. So, it's this really kind of beautiful mesh of just good filmmaking and good horror, storytelling. So
I'll have to check in with you when fall gets here, and I'm always looking for some old classic, usually black and white. Doesn't have to be black and white, but a classic kind of spooky film that I've never seen. I always try to get myself in the mood.
You need to see The Haunting.
I've seen it.
The original?
Yes.
The 1970s one?
No, isn't there one from like the 50s?
Maybe. Yeah.
I think it's the
60s.
Yeah, very
50s.
Black and white. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
My favorite one that I watched a couple.
That would be number 4.
Okay. If someone were to become a fan, if someone's listening right now and they watch the film, which they totally should, and I'll let you direct them to where they need to go. But if someone wanted to support you, what's the best way for them to support you, or even, like independent films in general?
Sure. So, the Resurrectionist, the short film version is online right now. You can go to our YouTube channel. So if you were to search Title Pending Productions is kind of our loose, studio name, if you will. If you were to type that in and maybe the name The Resurrectionist into YouTube, you would find it right there. Free to watch, no charge. So go do that now.
And I'll put those links in the show notes.
Cool. We also have a website, titlependingproductions.com, and that has dedicated pages to all of our previous films. I've got a short film up called Love is a Grave, which if you're into kind of Victorian spiritualism, absinthe, hauntings, cemeteries, there's a beautiful Victorian cemetery that I featured in that film. You can see that on the website as well. And then, we're all over Facebook, Title Pending Productions, on Twitter, TPPROD1, I think, on Twitter. Instagram. I have a personal Instagram, which is Tim Stevens Films. And I honestly post more stuff. You'll probably see more behind the scenes stuff on Tim Stevens Films Instagram than you will just about anywhere else. So that would be a good place to go check it out. Then in general, if you're just looking to support indie film, I would just go into sites like Indiegogo or Kickstarter, click on the film button and see what suits, your personal taste. It always surprises me when I do a crowdsourcing campaign. I'll get like a $50 donation from somebody in New Jersey that I've never heard of before nor met, and those are just people that are really benefactors of independent art. And, I think that's great because we're all out there trying to make our own thing, and it's easier in so many ways because cameras and lights are cheaper, but it's harder in so many ways because there's so many people doing their own thing, and it's something like hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of video being uploaded online every second. So it's hard to compete with that. And ultimately what I'm trying to do is, I've got this feature film version of the script, which I've written. It's ready to go. It just needs the producer to come to me and say, hey, I want to help you find the money to make this. And, if we could gather our budget, we could have this film done in a year and we could be seeing this in theaters.
That's exciting to think about.
So that's really what I'm hoping to do. That's why I made the short, is to use it as an example of listen, imagine this, but 90 minutes long and full scale feature film, a revenge Western is basically what it is, with Voodoo.
Well, do you have any existing right now, crowdsourcing, funding going on for this film? Or
I don't.
Is it kind of go individually project by project?
Yeah, just project by project. We finished up our crowdsourcing campaign in December of last year and then, supplemented the rest and made the film. Of course, there's always the option of doing a crowdsourcing campaign for the feature, but we would need, for a feature film, we're talking in the millions of dollars, probably not too much, 2 to 3 million maybe, which is still considered micro budget, funnily enough. But, we might, so the majority of it would be coming from investors, but, we still might crowdsource for a portion of the money that we need to maybe help the film get finished or to pay for, to pay for music to be recorded. Because we might spend all of our money up front and then we still need to finish the rest of the film. Because just because you're done shooting doesn't mean that the film is suddenly made. If anything, it's the biggest work comes after you're done filming. So that would be something to look out for in the future. But currently we're just trying to get eyes on the film, and that's why we're not charging. We just want people to go and watch it.
Absolutely. Well, we'll follow, and I wish you luck and keep us posted on how things are going. And I want you to know that you have now upped the ante. You've given the rest of my guests a challenge from now on, I'm going to require them to like get a kerosene lantern and and really put themselves in the right mood before we even do an interview. They're going to be like, thanks, that one director that was on there. God.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm sorry, guys, but it's just gonna make every episode that much more interesting.
It is. Well, thank you, sir. You rock. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. Just click on the Big Seance podcast logo or find it in the menu.
You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeart Radio.
Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line,
7755-TELL-ME.
That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.
The children of the night, what sweet music they made.